From the cartoon on the cover of Shabbir Akhtar's book, Be Careful About Muhammad, one might think that this was some tongue-in-cheek, humorous overview of a report on Salman Rushdie's book and the aftermath that followed from its publication. Reading into the book by a paragraph or two, one realizes that Dr. Akhtar is very serious about the subject which he is treating. Besides the limits to free speech and press, as indicated by the subtitle of the book, Dr. Akhtar also raises concerns about the social-political status of Muslim in Western lands, intercultural adaptations, problems of distributive justice, and even life and death issues. This book is a 2020 reprint of his reaction to the publication in 1988 of Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. Most of the updating is found in the preface to the second edition, which was expanded from a single page in the original to 29 in the new version, where he brings up-to-date events that transpired since the first printing, especially the discussion between pro-Muslim panels of debaters and their opposites, articles and reports that either strongly condemned Rushdie's book or gave it a pass with high praise on the other extreme, and a number of positions in between. Of equal concern were the events that followed from the printing of cartoons that were offensive to Muslims in the Danish press, as well as in the Charlie Hebdo Weekly, that led to the terrorist murder of 17 of its staff members in Paris. Associates of killers were just recently sentenced by French courts to as many as 30 years in prison. This, however, has not brought to an end the cartoon controversy, and Dr. Akhtar warns that they have not only not been resolved, but may reemerge at any time. The 6 chapters of the book focus on the shock to Muslim sensibilities and Dr. Akhtar's attempt at explaining the basis for them in the aftermath Rushdie's work caused within various religious and political factions in England, the Muslim Ummah, and even democratic countries throughout the world. Islamic religious doctrine, it seemed, had come face to contradictory face with the principle or right of free speech and expression. Dr. Akhtar's first objection to Salman Rushdie's book is what he calls a violation of historical events. I first read the Satanic Verses shortly after it came out, curious to see what all the hullabaloo was about. While my knowledge of Islam at the time was far less extensive than it is now, it was adequate enough to render clear that those sections dealing with the persons named so closely in the book, with living ones in the formative years and early history of Islam to one another, that making anything other than a direct connection with them was pretty much of a long shot, almost as much of a one as thinking that the scurrilous ways in which they were described would at worst only offend Muslim sensibilities in some mild form, much as Christians might shrug off Dr. Akhtar's claim that Christianity is, in his words, an aberration in the prophetic line from Judaism to Islam. Hardly a complimentary description, but anyone understanding Muslim beliefs will know why making such a claim has to be the case in order to remain theologically consistent. And so we leave it to powers above ourselves to decide the issue one way or another. But a simple brush-off was hardly to be the case with Muslim responses to the Satanic Verses or the counter-reactions on the part of non-Muslims to what eventually ensued. They were quite vocal and public, leading to demands that the book be burned on the one hand, all the way to a fatwa on the life of the author on the other. It led to social disorder, in some cases in England, and even worse in other countries as well. What can be done about such a scurrilous, revisionist report that goes so contrary to the received or classical tradition in Islam is something that we will leave for a little later in this review. But I'd like to begin with some of those things that it would seem could be more easily and efficiently addressed. Among them is the complaints of Dr. Akhtar on the way which the British government treats its Muslim minority. He specifically mentions the rejection of request for funds for Muslim schools as authorized by the Education Act of 1944. I mean, here we're talking about an act that has been in place for getting close to 80 years now. Catholic and Jewish schools enjoy such support, he tells us, but Muslim schools are denied it on the grounds that it will hurt relations between Muslims and non-Muslims because they will, quote, in the words of one parliamentarian, withdraw into their own cultural fortresses, unquote. This seems to be an ill-advised rationale, based more on a fallacy than on experiences which have already taken place in England between minority groups and the majority itself. Rather, it should be seen as an opportunity for the government and its representatives to engage personally with the members of the Muslim leadership and to forge stronger ties of mutual cooperation and goodwill. There's an echo in this objection to that raised by the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, arguing that allowing Catholics to enlist in the armed forces could well be setting up a traitorous fifth column should England ever go to war against a Catholic country. Such military persons might well turn their guns on their fellow Englishmen rather than on the enemy because of a similar religious allegiance. I think that there were already more than a fair number of Catholics in the English military at the time who simply kept their faith to themselves and were quite willing to fight for England, much as they did, their co-religionists did during the days of the Spanish Armada, as well as other instances when the realm was threatened. Hopefully, in the 30 years or so since Dr. Akhtar described this condition, a more just policy has been put in place to ameliorate its negative consequences. So too, one hopes, is true of the more general objections raised against the powerlessness of the Muslim community, as he puts it, and the result of what he describes as a systematic exclusion that his co-religionists suffer. I think the word systematic is a little more than a little strong here. If he wants a very good example of a systematic exclusion, he can find it in English history in the way Catholics were treated from the 16th to about the middle of the 18th century, where the Catholic Relief Act was brought up in 1778. As a Catholic, I'm very much interested in the name of the act, and as an American, very much taken by the year 1778, wondering what was going on in England in the application of its military, that they wanted to open up the ranks for enlistees that came from a hitherto systematically excluded religion. Systematic exclusion would mean that there are laws in place preventing people from, given racial background, national, ethnic, or religious, from being able to serve in certain capacities that are open to other citizens of the realm. Is this the case now? Well, was it even the case 30 years ago? Is it the case now? And has the situation improved? For instance, there are a number of Muslims who are PM members of parliament, although at about half the ratio of the population. One can look back and ask whether this is something that has been continually improving or not. I leave it to others who want to take the time to look into whether there has been a steady increase in the number of Muslims who have been elected to political office that starts to get closer to the ratio of their numbers in terms of the population of the country as a whole. But certainly there have been some in place, and even recently the mayor of London that was elected by what had to be a percentage far exceeding the number of Muslims living in London, was elected the mayor of that great city. It is highly unusual that immigrants coming into a new country are able to access political office in that first generation. Usually you have to build contacts, you have to establish constituencies, you have to get all kinds of support, and you have to make it rather clear to the population as a whole that you are subscribing to the fundamental principles of the political organization of that country. Which brings us to the question of intercultural melding and assimilation. It's usually rather easy when people go from one country to another that share a common culture. It is more difficult when there are acceptable norms in the country of an immigrant group that are not accepted within the country in which they seek to immigrate. So, for instance, something like honor killings. Recently, I understand, a father and members of his family killed his daughter because she would not agree to a marriage or remain in a marriage that she felt was not to her pleasure, not to her liking. This may be something tolerated in Muslim countries. It may even be something that is applauded, but it is not something that you can do in a Western nation that allows individuals to make choices about their marriage partners, or at least to veto the choices that are suggested by others, and not put themselves in a situation which they would find intolerable. Usually what happens after several generations is enough interweaving among the disparate parts, the disparate cultures, that both sides become comfortable enough with each other that the worst possible case scenarios that are sometimes dreamed up by those fearful of elements in this alien group are put to rest, or sufficiently so that it's only a minority of inconsequential voices that raise objections that are soon dismissed by the body politic as a whole. Along with the successes which Muslims have had into the political power structure in England, there are also the economic successes which are another leverage of power. For instance, the probably best known department store in England is Muslim-owned, as I understand. Muslims are owners of other businesses. They have their own homes and property. And recently an article was on the internet about two Muslim brothers, young men, who are successful entrepreneurs and have reached the billionaire status as far as their business success goes. They're presently involved in financing a state-of-the-art mosque in Bradford. Cultural adaptations of any long standing are rarely a one-way street. Both sides are going to be changed in one way or another. We've already looked at some of the ways in which the English society has been changed by its immigrant Muslim population. The reverse, however, when I was looking for some examples, Dr. Akhtar himself came most immediately to mind as a result of something that he writes in one of his later works. For instance, among Muslim promoters of Islam, there are two statements which they heavily emphasize, so much so that I have a habit of calling them Muslim mantras. The first is that the Quran has come to us unchanged down to any word or letter from the time that the ayahs were first uttered by the Prophet himself. Well, I leave that to scholars more knowledgeable about that particular claim than myself. The other, however, is that the Quran itself is self-evidently true because it is inimitable. That is, someone could not take and write verses that would have the same kind of quality, the same sort of exalted status or condition which the Quran itself has. And this is why the claim is made that the book is inherently inimitable. The manner in which there has been an evolution in thought with Dr. Akhtar can be seen from a comment which he makes in this now 20-plus-year-old, close to 30-plus-year-old book of the Quran is inimitable. And one of the challenges that is given in the Quran is that if you think it's not from God, try to write something like it and see how impossible that is. In his later book, much later book, just recently out, The New Testament in Muslim Eyes, where he deals with the letter of St. Paul to the Galatians, he writes this about this challenge. He notes, the Quran repeatedly challenges disbelievers to produce another Quran like the one given to Muhammad. This is from Surah 2, verses 23 to 24. Then Dr. Akhtar writes, logically, the challenge cannot be met, and the demand is, strictly speaking, incoherent. If the rival work is similar, it is not the same. If identical, it is a copy, not a rival. When I first heard this challenge, I thought to myself, gee, what is the criterion that would be used for someone arguing, use it as evidence of, in order to argue that the Quran is not divinely revealed? That has never been forthcoming. Furthermore, in one of his other books, entitled A Faith for All Season, Dr. Akhtar notes that there were two poets in the Muslim tradition who publicly claimed to have written verses that were at least of equal merit, if not superior to the ones in the Quran. And the results which they received for their endeavors was to be executed. Today, in many Muslim countries, it is a capital offense to attempt to do the very thing which the Quran says you should be able to do in order to prove to yourself that the Quranic verses are indeed divinely revealed. So there seems to be an awful lot of inconsistencies here in the Muslim tradition with respect to whether or not the Quran can be imitated. As far as I am concerned, any work of art, especially written works of art, which the Quran, into which category the Quran fits, is inherently incapable of being imitated. Shakespeare, for instance, could not imitate Hamlet, nor do any of the other tragedies imitate one another. They all stand on their own 2 feet. And so it would be with anything that is presented as a supposed alternative and opposed holy writing to the Quran itself. It's something that simply cannot be done inherently, and that is why the challenge is meaningless. Furthermore, any other religion can use this same argument with respect to their sacred texts. So Christians can use it for the New Testament, Mormons can use it for the Book of Mormon, Confucians for the Analects, Buddhists for their works, and so on. Now, there's an old adage that says, what proves anything, or can prove anything, in this sense, really proves nothing at all. Also, this position is not a too very well disguised fallacious argument called shifting the burden of proof. The way it happens is that someone makes a claim, the person who hears it has his doubts about it or demurs, refuses to accept it, and then the person making the claim says to the one who won't, well, prove to me that I'm wrong. Well, that's not the way it works. Usually it is the person who makes the claim that is the one who has the responsibility for bringing evidence in its support. We have something a little bit like this that happened just recently in a court here in the United States, where a plaintiff went to the judge saying that he should throw out the results of an election in that state because there was so much fraud and impropriety involved in the election itself. The judge asked for the data, the evidence in support of this, and the plaintiff retorted by saying, well, prove to me that I don't have this evidence. And of course, the judge threw the plaintiff's case out of the courtroom. So that's not the way it works. And now, there may be instances where it is important enough for a person who doesn't accept a claim to prove that it's false. So, for instance, if one is charged with a crime, one wants to present evidence that exculpates that individual. And in the case here of religious claims, where the issue of salvation or damnation, where there are eternal repercussions or consequences to what is claimed, may very well be enough reason for individuals hearing these proposals being made to offer evidence in their refutation. The truth or falsity of religious claims notwithstanding, the issue that most troubles Dr. Akhtar and the Muslim world as a whole was the scurrilous and unjust, as far as they are concerned, and I think that they can make a pretty good case of it, the unjust way in which Salman Rushdie represented the individuals and the history of the early years of Islam. Dr. Akhtar writes, Rushdie has every right to give a secular, humanist vision of the birth of a great world's religion. Indeed, a plausible secular account of revelation would be an indispensable part of any radical reservation about the Islamic outlook. Well, that is certainly quite liberal of Dr. Akhtar to state. Unfortunately, some of his co-religionists don't seem to follow through on what Dr. Akhtar writes here. For instance, a British historian, Tom Holland, recently put out a video entitled Empire of Faith. And in it, he presented what seems to me to be a totally respectful approach to and an attempt at appreciating the early formative years of the Islamic religion. What he came up with was pretty much a void that the classical or received tradition about Islam had very little in terms of evidential support of any sort. Writings from other sources other than Islamic ones, which are at least 100 or more years after the founding of the religion, or the supposed founding of the religion itself, and did not reach, as far as I could see, any negative conclusions, certainly nothing scurrilous in the way that Rushdie had done in his book. And yet for all that, there was a great deal of pressure placed on the BBC to never show that video again, although it really doesn't work because the video is available on YouTube or other platforms, and so an attempt here to silence something which seems to fall well into the category as described by Dr. Akhtar was just simply violated by these persons who didn't want what they considered something too critical of their religion to be shown again on a public network. What is probably most troublesome to the Western world is the fact that Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa of death on Salman Rushdie for what he had written. Now, Dr. Akhtar tries to explain and make us understand that in Islamic countries there is far more of a parallel, of an interweaving between mosque and state. Islam has not undergone the same kind of experiences which we have in the Western countries that have created a separation, a needed for separation between church and state. That is where members of the political structure should concern themselves with the behaviors of citizens and not with their theological preferences, and that religions should be concerned with the theological and religious welfare and teaching of and direction of their charges, and not involve themselves in trying to foster legislation which is to their favor and at the expense of other denominations or of other religions. This is why the notion here of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, which is to a large extent a personal thing, should be left outside of the purview of the secular society, out of the political society itself. Now, in the case of Islam, whose first formative experience is that of a theocracy, is that in which its leader was both the religious as well as the political and military and moral leader of that religion, all wrapped up in one, making these distinctions is a lot more difficult. In fact, attempts at separating the two seems to be a path that would lead to what Shabbir Akhtar, Salman Rushdie was sentenced to death for, and that is for creating chaos, for the disruption of the social order. How would that happen? Well, if you start planting seeds of doubt about the veracity of the Islamic religion, then you start to erode the basis on which the political structure of an Islamic state can claim to have the authority to bind the conscience of its people. This is why in Saudi Arabia, for instance, there has been for a number of years now the bringing in of Western scientists into the country, claiming that they would be given free rein in the discussion of scientific topics that are then asked questions about the Quran and the seeming scientific prophecies that are contained within the book under conditions that one might call duress. After all, you don't like to insult your hosts. They're paying for your way, and you're going to try to come up with the more favorable interpretation of some of the ayahs which you are presented, and then asked whether they are somehow or another prophetic in terms of scientific discoveries that were to be made centuries later. These were then collected, edited, and presented for public viewing to the population at large. This is an attempt here, and this was, by the way, described in the New York Times a number of years ago, an attempt to bolster the belief of the population as a whole in the truths of the religion, in support then of the governing status that is presently in place in Saudi Arabia. And the same thing can be done too in other countries as well. In Chapter 5, What's Wrong with Fundamentalism, Dr. Akhtar notes that critics of Islamic fundamentalism tend to be more heavy-handed than in their critique of the same kind of movements in other religions such as Christianity or Judaism or what have you. Well, if fundamentalism is defined as a movement wherein a religious community seeking to get rid of unwanted later developments for the purpose of returning back to its original mission, return to the sources that were foundational in their coming to be and their development, in order to hit a reset button so as to move forward without falling into these unwanted developments, then it would seem as if there's not going to be too much of a difference in how critics respond to that fundamentalism, irrespective of what religion it's working in. It seems to be more than that. It's the religious absolutism, for lack of a better word, that seems to evolve out of that fundamentalism. Now, let's unpack this. Among believers, irrespective of their denomination or religion, there are certain common principles which it seems they're all agreed with. In the area of morality, it is to do the good and to avoid the evil. From an epistemological perspective, it is to affirm the truth and to deny falsehoods or errors. Among theists, the view is that only true religion has the right to exist. And in the abstract or the ideal, this is all fine and wonderful. They can all agree to that. The problem is when we try to bring this down into the concrete material order, this messy reality of so many parts in tension and conflict that we have to deal with, where we have to make decisions that come out of a fallible human mind. There's where the problem resides. Now, if we look at religion, we have to realize that it is fundamentally a belief system. Epistemologically, it is not as certain as, say, for instance, some of the claims of science are, where persons can go back to the original data or information that was used by scientists in the formation of their theories. The doctrines of religion are something that are accepted primarily on faith. No Jew was present when the voice out of the burning bush spoke to Moses. No Christian was there when Christ resurrected from the tomb or ascended into heaven. No Muslim was there to hear the angel Gabriel whisper the ayahs into Muhammad's ears. These are all things that we take on faith. And faith is a less epistemically certain position than certain facts that occur in the world. For instance, killing someone, succeeding in killing someone, is an act of which one can be certain as to its outcome. Whether one pulls the trigger or whether one gives someone the right to pull the trigger is irrespective. When the killing has occurred, one is certain as to what one has done. However, the motive for why it is done, the theological justification for it, that is something that is only believed, less epistemically certain. So it appears that what we have here is an inversion of priorities, where the less epistemically certain is taken as a justification for the creation of an act that is morally reprehensible. And this is why Western commentators have a problem with one country issuing a death sentence on someone else living in another country for something that they did which was an affront to religion. Dr. Akhtar is correct in saying that other religions, Christianity included, have engaged in the same kind of activity in the past, and that is to the shame of the Christian religion, certainly, because Jesus gives us only one reaction to someone unwilling to listen to or subscribe to the good news which he sent his apostles out to preach. Namely, shake the dust off your sandals of their homes which you visited or the cities which you passed through. Or the other, which is given by the apostles or disciples, to shun the company of sinners, but never to engage in any kind of coercive action against them, to engage in some sort of punishment, to involve oneself, to the shame of Christians, in wars of religion or inquisitions or pogroms or ghettoizing people or making them wear certain kinds of clothing that identify them, wherein they are treated as pariahs within the society in which they live. That's not the higher principles by which Christians should be living. That Muslims were offended by Rushdie's characterization of the formation of Islam goes without saying, although it seems that the furor has died down over the past 30 years, stoked from time to time by new instances of that kind of thing. Christians can be sympathetic to this when their religion is treated in this same reprehensible manner. For instance, recently there was one artist who took a representation of the Blessed Virgin Mary and covered it with dog feces and displayed it in a museum. What kind of point he was trying to make with that, other than either he didn't like the Blessed Virgin or he had something against Mariology, where it is celebrated among certain Christian religions. Well, it seems to be self-defeating to do it that way. I think the first thing any even moderately believing Muslim, the reaction to reading something like the satanic verses, would be to put up all kinds of psychological defense mechanisms against what Rushdie is writing, or what Rushdie has written. The voice of truth is best heard when it is soft and when it is respectful. There's an old saying about the truth that it shall make you free. I think, however, that we can add a proviso to that. Before freedom, it will tick you off because it requires that you abandon some kind of illusion or some kind of myth that up to that point a person has found comforting or support. As to some of the other divisions, which are rooted in deep cultural differences, one can only hope that in time an emphasis on commonalities will overcome the concerns that come out of differences. This is not something that is resolvable, it seems to me, by legislation or that can be resolved within the course of one or maybe even two generations. It's going to take a little bit more of an acclimation on the part of the immigrants as well as the country to which they immigrated to slowly, bit by bit, work the tensions out. Certainly the American experience has been that by and large immigration has been a boon to the welfare of the United States and not a detriment. And one can only hope that this is the case in all countries where these sorts of movements take place. For those that are interested in dealing with this problem from either side, Dr. Akhtar's book is highly recommended as a list of areas where work needs to be done and understanding the issue from the Muslim point of view.